All right, let's start with chapter 10 and what I like to refer to as tricky concepts. We're going to be looking at the review questions for chapter 10, but we're not going to be addressing all of the review questions. Instead, we're going to focus on, again, the trickier ones. And the trickier ones in my mind are review questions 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, and 10. So let's start with question 2. What is meant by the Frank-Starling law of the heart? The Frank-Starling law of the heart suggests that the greater the end diastolic volume, the greater the amount of blood that's put into the ventricles from the veins, the greater the blood is going to come out of the ventricles with every stroke volume. So the Frank-Starling law of the heart. The Frank-Starling law of the heart matches end diastolic volume with stroke volume. The more blood that's returned to the ventricles, the more blood that's returned to the heart, the more blood those ventricles will pump out. And this is because when the ventricles are filled and filled and filled with more and more blood, the actin and myosin cross bridges in those cardiac myocytes become more numerous. And when the cardiac muscle is stimulated to contract, more cross bridging can occur, a more forceful contraction can occur, and thus more volume can be pumped out of the heart. That's the Frank-Starling law of the heart, matching end diastolic volume with stroke volume. All right, let's move on to question number 3. According to Poisson, what factors determine resistance to flow? And which of these factors has the most impact on the cardiovascular system? Well, Poisson states that resistance, always denoted with a capital R, is proportional to the length of the blood vessel, the viscosity of the blood, and inversely proportional to the size of the blood vessel that the blood has to pump through. That is the radius of the blood vessel to the fourth power. Please note that the size of the blood vessel has a huge impact on resistance. To the fourth power is the radius. Also note that the size of the blood vessel, the radius, is in the denominator. So as the radius of a blood vessel gets smaller because of vasoconstriction, the resistance to blood flow goes way up. And again, it's to the fourth power, meaning not much of a change has to occur in vessel size to greatly affect resistance. A small reduction in vessel size will lead to a very large increase in resistance. All right. Question number 5. Where in the circulatory system is the greatest resistance to flow encountered? How is this resistance regulated, and what is the outcome of changing this resistance? Well, all blood vessels contribute resistance. All blood vessels have blood flowing through them. Hence, all blood vessels have resistance to flow. However, in the human circulatory system, the greatest resistance to flow is encountered in the arterioles. Arterioles are relatively small, they're lined with smooth muscle, and they constrict or dilate. They follow Poisson's law. They change their size, even just a little, and have a significant impact on the resistance to flow. How is resistance regulated, and what is the outcome of changing this resistance? The regulation of resistance through arterioles is regulated primarily by metabolism. With increase in metabolism, there's a decrease in resistance and an easier time of getting blood flow to that particular vascular bed or organ. What is the outcome of changing this resistance? Well, a reduction in resistance to blood flow will lead to an increase in blood flow. Exercising muscle, for instance, shows a reduction in arteriolar resistance. the arterioles get bigger, and blood flow to exercising muscle is increased. Another factor that regulates resistance is the sympathetic nervous system. An increase in sympathetic activity through release of norepinephrine or epinephrine from the adrenal gland will constrict arterioles, and blood pressure will go up as resistance through those blood vessels also goes up. All right, question number 6, very closely related. If pressure was held constant, what would be the effect on flow if a vessel's radius was doubled or reduced in size by threefold? Well, remember, flow is equal to the change in pressure over resistance. This is true whether you're talking about a small regional flow or if you're talking cardiac output. Cardiac output, big Q dot, is equal to mean arterial blood pressure divided by total peripheral resistance, the resistance of the entire vascular bed, the entire vasculature. Now the question is, if pressure is held constant, so let's hold this pressure term constant here. If pressure is held constant, what would be the effect on flow if a vessel's radius was doubled? Now remember the relationship between resistance and vessel size. Resistance is proportional to 1 over radius to the 4th power. I got rid of those other terms in the numerator from Poisson, and I just put 1 over radius to the 4th power. If the radius is doubled, the vessel becomes 2 times larger. The factor, the influence rather on resistance is 2 to the 4th power. Because remember, vessel size and the effect of vessel size on resistance has to be considered to the 4th power. So if a vessel becomes twice as big, it goes from, say, 10 microns to 20 microns. An arteriole dilates 20 microns. The resistance through that arteriole falls a lot. 2 to the 4th power, which is equal to 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16. Resistance would fall 16-fold. If resistance dropped 16-fold and pressure is kept the same, what's the effect on flow? With pressure kept the same and the vessel's now 16 times easier to get blood flow to flow through it, flow would go up 16-fold. The other part of question 6 says, what would be the effect on flow if a vessel's radius is reduced in size by threefold? For instance, if it was 30 micron in diameter and constricted down to 10 microns, reduced by threefold. The same relationship now. Resistance is proportional to 1 over radius to the 4th power. This time we're talking about 3 to the 4th power. The resistance change is 3 times 3 times 3 times 3. 3 times 3 is 9, times 3 is 27, times 3 is 81. If a vessel becomes 3 times smaller, the resistance goes up 81 times. Again, vessel is reduced in size threefold, 30 microns down to 10. The resistance goes up 81 times. For the same pressure, flow would be reduced 81 times. So how is flow regulated to different vascular beds? By metabolism determining the size of the arterioles feeding blood to that vascular bed. Small changes in resistance lead to very large changes in flow. All right. Question 7. What 4 factors govern capillary exchange of fluid and dissolved elements? This question is looking at bulk fluid flow through capillaries. We'll draw a capillary this way on the board. And on the left-hand side, is the arteriolar side of the capillary, and on the right-hand side is the side that feeds blood to the veins, or the venular side. Now, what four factors govern capillary exchange of fluid and dissolved elements? This is bulk fluid flow, this idea. And bulk fluid flow is the movement of fluid and dissolved elements in or out of the capillaries through those pores. The movement of fluid out of capillaries is referred to as filtration. And the movement of fluid into capillaries is referred to as reabsorption. So let's look at the four factors that regulate bulk fluid flow, these processes of filtration and reabsorption. Factor number one, blood flows into capillaries under pressure. It has a blood pressure. This pressure pushes the blood out through those pores. So the first factor to consider is capillary blood pressure. Capillary blood pressure favors filtration. Factor number two. In the plasma are very large proteins, too large to get out of the pores. Hence they're termed plasma proteins. These proteins also carry a charge. And because of this, they attract water. These charged proteins that stay in the plasma then favor reabsorption. Factor number three. Outside of these capillaries is a fluid-filled area, the interstitium, the space between cells. Because this is a fluid-filled area, there is a fluid pressure pushing back on the capillaries. This interstitial fluid pressure tends to push fluid into the capillaries. That is, interstitial fluid pressure favors reabsorption. And factor number four, the possibility that there are large proteins out in this interstitial space, again, with charge. And these large interstitial proteins would attract water. Thus, these interstitial proteins would favor filtration. Let's summarize all four of them. Number one, capillary blood pressure favors filtration. Number two, plasma protein osmotic pressure favors reabsorption, movement of fluid into the capillaries. Factor number three, interstitial fluid pressure pushes fluid in to the capillaries. That is, interstitial fluid pressure favors reabsorption. And factor number four, the possibility of large proteins out in the interstitial space carrying charge, attracting water, favoring filtration. interstitial protein osmotic pressure. Favor filtration. In a healthy human circulation, factor number 4 is not even a player. In the healthy circulation, there are not large proteins accumulating in the interstitium, in the spaces between the capillaries. So really, we can cross that one right off in the healthy situation. So we're down to 3 factors: capillary blood pressure, plasma protein osmotic pressure, and interstitial fluid pressure. Over the length of the entire capillary bed, more fluid leaves the capillaries than enters. That is, there's a net filtration. More fluid leaves. And in that fluid are dissolved elements like ions, glucose, etc. So, over the length of a capillary bed, there is a net filtration. And out of the billions of capillaries all over the body, then, there's net filtration. Every day, there's net filtration in excess of several liters, 2 or 3 liters. This extra fluid that's filtered is absorbed by the lymphatics and returned back to the veins, and thus back into the blood, into the plasma volume. All right, last question, and another tricky one, is question number 10. What is the barrel reflex? How is it manifest? That is, how is it triggered? And what role does it play? Well, the barrel reflex, as the name implies, is a pressure reflex. The barrel reflex is a reflex regulation of mean arterial blood pressure. Mean arterial blood pressure is a regulated variable. That is, there is a set point for mean arterial blood pressure. And changes above or below that mean arterial blood pressure evoke the barrel reflex. There are special nerve endings in large arteries in the body, primarily found in the aorta and the carotid arteries, and these nerve endings are always sensing blood pressure change. These nerve endings relay information to the cardiovascular control center in the medulla. And with this information, the cardiovascular control center in the medulla determines the amount of sympathetic efferent outflow to the heart and blood vessels. So imagine there was a sudden reduction in blood pressure. Say I was laying in bed, the fire alarm went off, I jumped out of bed, and my blood pressure suddenly fell as I became vertical. What would happen? Well, the baroreceptors would be sending information to the cardiovascular control centers, and actually they would send less information when there's a sudden reduction in pressure. And the cardiovascular control center would respond to this reduced activity from the baroreceptors by increasing sympathetic activity. Thus, heart rate would go up, stroke volume would go up, cardiac output goes up. The increase in sympathetic activity would also increase peripheral resistance. The arterioles are constricted. An increase in cardiac output and an increase in peripheral resistance would tend to increase mean arterial blood pressure. What about the opposite case? What if there was a sudden increase in blood pressure? Like I got angry suddenly, or I didn't understand the lecture. My blood pressure just went up and up and up and up. This increase in blood pressure would result in increased firing of those baroreceptors in the aorta and the carotid arteries. They would increase their activity, increase their afferent traffic to the cardiovascular control center in the medulla. The medulla would respond by decreasing sympathetic activity and increasing parasympathetic activity. The end result would be a reduction in heart rate, stroke volume, and a dilation of arterioles. That is, cardiac output would go down. At the same time, peripheral resistance goes down. This would quickly lower blood pressure back to set point. This baroreflex is used all the time, beat to beat or minute to minute, to maintain our mean arterial blood pressure fairly constant over the course of a day. I hope you find these tricky concepts a little more clear now. Keep looking at these questions, keep looking at chapter 10, and we'll see you again real soon.